All right, so let's get fancy with CSS selectors. So previously, we had reflect on something. I mentioned there's different data types. I haven't done anything with that yet. So we're going to look at the idea of making something fancy and how reflecting reflecting a property to its attribute is of value to us. So just so you're aware of what I did, I fired up Polaris chip, but it's Polaris chip like where it started. So my card had nothing in it. I basically just added an image and a title, and then I hard coded some text. So it's not exactly what you're supposed to do. It's sort of where about half of you were, right? Some of the things are variables, some things are not. So we'll get to the image thing. I posted a link for how we can clean that up. But where fancy comes into play is you can set properties, right? So I could add fancy here as I add the code snippet for you. So if you want to literally go copy and paste, right? We're adding a new property called fancy, right? So I'm going to copy this into the constructor, which I'm setting to false. And then I will copy this into my properties area, right? So this says that we've got our title, which is a string, but then we've got this new value that we're going to support called fancy, which is a Boolean, meaning it'll just go true or false. We're going to default the value to false, and then we're going to reflect the value, which means it will show up in the DOM. So the reason we want it to show up in the DOM, please don't be a permanent marker. You are a permanent marker. One of you tried to make me write this board a permanent marker. That's awesome. Appreciate it. So previously, when we reflected something, it was like my card, and then we reflected, can't speak, image, right? And it was just so that you could then see, hey, when I make this change to this property, it shows up in the page. But the reason that we actually want to reflect values is if I have fancy on here, internal to the card, if I make the card fancy, which I just love saying fancy over and over again, because this sits in the DOM, it's now something that I can use as a CSS selector. Okay? So an attribute-based selector for this could look like my hyphen card, so tag name. That then becomes a valid selector, right? Think of it like classes, except this is special. Well, it's fancy actually, because internal to the element, that can be modified on the fly. So by having that be a valid CSS selector, this is now possible. So if I have host, paste in here so we get nice color coding and spacing, my goodness. Ugh. There we go. 2 spaces, not 4. We don't have any psychopaths here. All right. So we can see that we have this special hellish syntax. I apologize in advance for constantly correcting you on getting it wrong. So, as mentioned before, :host is a way of saying me, like this thing that I'm applying these default styles. You can then say, if the default styles thing has the fancy tag on it, do such and such a thing. So technically, you could do :host, and it's like that. It'll drop real big, bracket, fancy, bracket, big, right? It has to be. This is one of the only times that happens where it has to be in these parens, unfortunately. So this says when we set fancy, the property, then apply this CSS. So I'm going to go into the page. I've got my card. And now if I have my card with its defaults, but I make my card and it has fancy, it is fancy, isn't it? Wow. All right. So we've got a box shadow on it, and it's pink for Valentine's Day coming up. It actually goes with the flowers. They're sick. Okay. So that is a low-level capability you can leverage over and over again. Super useful in my own work when it comes to like hover states. Instead of actually using :hover, I will set a property for hovered or active or activated, something like that, and then be able to see the data and throttle it that way. So that is one additional enhancement capability. The next one is in your card right now that you have up. I want you to attempt to see where I have cool stuff as content. Now, a lot of you have description or details, something like this dot whatever. I want you to make your card say cool stuff as content here, but bold the word content. But go ahead and do that. Like you're passing in a value. Right. Cool stuff here. I'll replace that with this dot description. And make a description, which is a string, and then we'll give this description equals nothing. Anyone notice anything? What do you get? Were you able to make the text bold? No. Why? Yeah. Just passes it in as a string. Lit is sanitizing based on that data. Every single one of these things. Now, it would be awesome if I could say, well, for description is like type HTML, but that's not a thing. That's not a valid data type. So we have another tag that is part of the web component specification specifically for this sort of a thing. And so it's called slot. If I can find it. There we go. Right. So I'm going to wrap my description in slot just so we can see what the difference is. This is more of a feature that feels like a bug, but I leverage this quite a bit. All right. So a slot tag only works in Shadow DOM, which means it only works in web components. This tag will never show up anywhere else. If you put a slot tag up in your main document, it ain't really going to do anything. But at first, I should see no change by doing that. All right, it's still just there. And that's because what a slot tag does is it says anything that's placed inside of this tag, render it here. Right? So it becomes about the implementation of the tag. So if we go up into our index and I've got my card, this area now becomes what gets printed there. So what the slot tag is doing is it's taking the light DOM or the stuff that's between your tag and saying, render that here. Right? If it's strong, you never think, well, obviously it's going to render the stuff that's between there. It's going to render things and it's going to apply a certain style. If it's a paragraph, obviously it's going to render the text. You don't even think about that. But there has to be a concept, very low level, to allow that to happen. Case in point, an image. If you make an image tag incorrectly and it has an open and close and you put stuff between it, it doesn't do anything because that's not the way that tag is written. It has no concept of things inside of it. All right. So what slot lets us do is say, when someone puts other stuff inside this tag, render it over here. Now, there's lots of design flexibility associated with that. You can have multiple name slots. We're not getting into anything like that right now. But the key thing this lets you do is take HTML and print it there. So another fun cascading capability of that is because HTML stacks in HTML, I could put my fancy card in my fancy card, right? I could start to do things like that because it's HTML rendering in other HTML. And I don't know that I would really want to do that. Although I have had instances of doing that. Menus, for example, where you have nested menu items, you do actually want to do things like cascading items inside other items. It's a little weird, but not impossible. So with the slot, then you can see in this case, I've actually supported by what I'm going to say, both APIs, right? And so we need to start thinking of these elements and these design decisions as far as reflected properties, as far as the properties we use, as far as where slots are, as an API. Imagine it took 11 years for spec authors to come up with the way that you all could become other spec authors. By that, I mean web spec authors, right? It took a long time to get things like the video tag, actually like 6 years, to agree upon what a video is on the internet as far as the low level guts of that thing. So we need to start thinking of our tags as full-blown APIs. Like, what could I add to this tag to do fill in the blank? Oh, I could put this content inside of it so it would render here, and start to be able to get into full functionality as far as what we can do. Let me take my, there we go. Okay, at least get my card out of my cart. All right. So the next capability, and some of this is reality, and we're going to practice this again next week, and honestly we'll just keep practicing it over and over again. It's difficult, but from my perspective, really easy to teach you all HTML and CSS. There's structure, there's design. Logic is something that people fall off a cliff with over and over again. So if this becomes you, then ask for help, and you're not alone in this. All right. The logistical feedback loop of user interacts with thing, events occur, I listen to those events, I do stuff as a result. Right. We will keep practicing this. So this is the baby step into that. So in this, and I've written it up for you, right? Because this came up the other day. All right. So there were a couple people I corrected about the way that they had their code structured. They had all the JavaScript in the card. And I was asked, are we just making design elements, or is there actual JavaScript that's useful to attach to the element? So with a card, to be perfectly honest, no. It's just sort of a card. But I wanted to add an example so we could see what that might look like as we get into more sophisticated elements that are not just purely design. So in this example, we're going to add a method called openChanged. What openChanged is going to do is programmatically flip the state of Fancy. And it's going to do so based on a new tag opening and closing. So I left some stuff behind so that you can do your own research. But details and summary is a tag that lets you do this. Now, this is, again, a BFD of the web. This didn't exist for the first, 20 years that I wrote web code. And so you would have all these plugins and libraries and non-standard ways of clicking a thing to make it show the contents, because this is a pretty common interaction UI pattern. So what details does is it takes the very first tag it assumes is summary, and summary then shows up here and becomes the collapsible thing. Then whatever the next thing after it is what becomes the content of that little card, in effect. So what I'm going to do is add support for a ridiculous amount of content. Right now, part of the issue with our, I'm just going to paste this a zillion times. Part of the issue with our design currently is I picked an image that's astronomically large. All right, so that's a different issue. But for the time being, I'm just going to forcibly set this image to a width of 200 pixels. All right, just so that we're at least can see what's going on. All right, so what I want to do is add a collapse here. And so that way it actually says description, and then you click, and then you can see what the full description is. All right, so to do that, I believe I have the code in there for you, but this. There it is. Okay, so we got details. All right, so I'm going to copy this details block. And we're going to throw this in where the description is currently. Space this a little nicer. Get rid of the slots. I don't need that wrapping div just for funsies. Details right there. All right. And so it's a details tag. Should have a summary slot with that description fallback, so that way when I hit save, let's see what happens. We get this. All right, so I click description. That one doesn't have a description, apparently. Oh, this one does. Yes, that's right. The other one doesn't have a description. Let me make a description on that second one so that it at least has something. Okay, there we go. All right. So does anyone notice anything about the difference between these two? Anything functional other than one is pretty in pink? No. All right. Here, we'll do this then. We'll move this over and I will get rid of fancy. How about now? Yeah. Right. So fancy's there. It's showing the contents. Now, if I close fancy, right? So at the moment, the way that this code is written, fancy is actually toggling this to be open. Yes.
Is it because that we had it set so anytime it registers any change, even if it's not us clicking, it'll activate, and since we're changing it, it's activating?
So I haven't added that yet, but the reason that this currently is doing this is because of this, which is another concept, and we'll keep looking at examples of this. So if you read the docs on details, I could write this just like this. I could say details open. All right, now it's just open because that's what I'm setting. I'm saying, hey, this thing is here. It defaults. It is open. What this is saying is a huge part of why people use lit and all of these libraries. It's because they're data reactive. We react to changes based on what you're putting in and do something. And so this is in the lit tutorial stuff. And again, we'll keep looking at it. But what this reads as is set open to a Boolean evaluation of whatever the value of fancy is. So when fancy starts out as true, this starts out as true. When fancy is false, this is false. Everybody following? All right. So this is the super tiny detail that basically is in the lower levels as to why we can have anything fun on the internet. If I can change fancy after the fact, I get data reactivity. All right. So I have to be able to update fancy, but if fancy is there, I should be able to go to this. Okay, and I've got my card. And if I take fancy away, the card closes. If I add fancy back in, it shows up. Now, it's not to say that we need to always peg design state to data state, but this is more or less how everything works on the internet as far as an interactive application, as stupidly simple as this example is. Okay, I click a button. That generates an event. That event sets a value. Other things react to the value changing. And it just keeps cascading over and over. I hit refresh on a page. It looks at the URL, changes a value. Everything reacts to the value. All right, so I've got my two things here. One's fancy, one's not. Now, an issue with what this currently has, right? If I click and close this, right? Why are we're not dropping fancy? See, like previously, if I go and set fancy on here, and take this my card, and I click and expand or close, I get that functionality. But if Would
it be because the fact that it's open is relying on fancy, but fancy's not relying on the fact that it's open?
Exactly. Everybody hear that? And I'll say it for this recording thing that's going on, I hope, still. Right? Fancy, or the collapsing, is reacting to fancy, but fancy is not reacting to the collapsing. So we end up with needing to account for, this is called two-way data binding, for example. Nothing operates, no modern libraries do two-way data binding. But, so we've got, we've got these two considerations we have to pay attention to, all right? So when the data changes, it's changing the design. And in this case, it's actually, get rid of that text there. In this case, it's actually throttling that to open and close. But that's one-way data binding. It means a value changes and a thing occurs. What you just described is we need to go the other direction. We need some way that when the user changes something, that it changes the value. That's called two-way data binding. As in the value changes, I respond to it on both sides. So to get that relationship, all right, and I've got over here in the docs, we've cheated a bit, right? So what I did was I went and I read the docs and I said, okay, there's this event called toggle. Now, as a quick thing, why would I not listen for clicking? Because that's what I'm doing if I wanted to make sure that Fancy was kept in sync. Yeah.
You could be clicking on something else.
I could be clicking on something else. Absolutely. There could be that also requires that someone clicks it. It's literally the only way to modify at that point, right? So I read through the docs on details, right? And the nice thing with all the HTML elements as documented on there, right, goes into painstaking detail. This is where I said, oh, it has open, and that makes it open or close. But the other thing I watched for was, oh, it has events. So this says you can add an event listener for toggle on the details tag and respond to whether or not it is now open or closed. All right, so not everything is going to let you have toggle. Everything is going to let you have click. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to swap this out, and I'm going to have to add this open changed thing below. All right, so let's do these two parts. All right, I've got Fancy. Open changed. All right. And then I got to copy my open changed. It's fun to make this button off to the side, and yet I still copy and paste. And this is important. When we're adding methods to our class, make sure they're not inside the render, right? And getting mucked up with everything else. So there's a note here that says this. I want to at least detour to this for a second. Right? So when you see things like there's a question mark, open, or you see at toggle, this is not the HTML specification. This is magic stuff that Lit is doing. All right? So I generally don't like things like that. In the industry, this is commonly referred to as syntactical sugar. It's things that you sprinkle into code that then apply meaning or make it easier to write. So for example, when you do at toggle, or if you did at click, that is shorthand for the following, which you could write. Think of it like the jQuery examples at the beginning of class, right? jQuery is just a shorthand way of doing certain operations. So if you wanted to not do this fancy syntax, which is equivalent to an event listener for toggle, you could write this.shadow root.query selector details.add event listener toggle as the event name dot this, right? Run this method whenever toggle is called. So instead of people writing that over and over and over again, the authors of Lit added this nice little shorthand where you just do at, right? So at the event name and then the thing to run. All right. So the thing to run is going to be open changed. So if this works, I should be able to close this and Fancy goes away now. All right, and in fact, if we look at the data model, right, we've got that there, and I toggle, see how Fancy flashes in the page. All right. So what's happening is The act of toggling this is firing an event. The event is listened to and runs the method in question. And the method in question here is called open changed. Scoot that over. All right. So I'm listening for toggle. Open changed runs. Anytime we're running an event or we're listening, we get E is what people commonly write this as. We get an event object. Details about what the hell that was. So the easiest way that I establish a pattern for learning how these things work, even this, to be perfectly honest, as I was rigging this demo up, is to do console.log. And so every time I click this, it's telling me whether it's opened or closed. All right. It's doing that because I put up here console.log e.newstate. Now, I knew to do that because previously I had another console.log for just E. So I click, and it says, hey, toggle event. And then I look through toggle event and go, oh, this claims to have something called new state and it's closed. Okay, so then I should have support for when something literally says opened or literally says, open or closed. Now, fun thing with these events, not fun thing, annoying for timing as someone that writes this stuff, right? The page loads and the event fires. Right? But the event fired because in the page, I already wrote that this is fancy. So it fired because fancy was being set into that. Technically, it's not open for like a fraction of a second that you don't see, and then it's open. So even though we don't see it open, the code is going to go open that thing, which is going to fire the event, which then we're going to capture. So that's only firing on this one because it was set initially. If I go into the code and we say that this is no longer fancy, right, we won't get that event because nothing told that to open. Now, if I open it, then we're going to get that event. The other reason that these events become really important as we go is, this one's not setting target, unfortunately. Click events, especially, will tell you what you clicked on, which seems minor, but if you have a full application, I need the card or whatever to know what part of the card was clicked on, which card was clicked on, what should I do this operation to? So that data is all there when you click, when you scroll, when you toggle in this case, when you check a box. There's hundreds of different event types, and you can even make up your own, as we will later in the semester. Does anyone not get this relationship? All right, so that is the bulk of what I got today. I have some additional design considerations listed here so that you can make sure your stuff doesn't overflow. It's a very simple thing. Throw that in there real quick. There's also a link to an article on a very basic way to handle images based on aspect ratio. So what this just added is right here. All right, so looking at that code, you can see I target details and summary. I just forcibly apply some nice things to that. Then, much like before with fancy, you can actually do selectors this way. What the hell did I just click on? You can do selectors this way. So for example, this is saying when open changes on the details tag, then change the font on summary to be bold, right? So when I click description, that becomes bold. Yo.
I don't know. This is kind of like a weird question.
Love them.
If we use like when we use non-vanilla like parts of like JavaScript, is that like kind of reducing like the adaptability or scalability
Yes.
of code?
Scalability, no.
Well, actually, scalability, I feel like would that help it? But like adaptability, it's like then you can't.
I can't. So every
Every
time we use a convention that is specific to a library or framework, it means that porting to any other library or framework is not just copy and paste. So generally speaking, I try to stick with things that are spec that work in every browser for that reason, right? So at toggle or if I added at click and then I try to repurpose this code directly in a React app, that's not a thing. Now, industry, huge team, 50 people, probably don't give a crap about what I just said. But if you're Google and you have projects that are in Angular and are in Lit and there's like 20 different projects, it's really important that they stick to, we do everything in Lit, we do everything in Angular. A lot of bigger companies can, the Booz Allens of the world, and I'm just using it as an example, I don't actually know, I'm just saying gigantic companies that do lots of different projects. If they have a team doing React and a team doing Angular and a team doing web components and a team doing Vue, right? The more conventions you have specific to those frameworks, the less portable the code is between them in general. Scalability wise, though, no. I mean, it's the size of the library. However, that would have an implication if I'm entirely writing JavaScript based on React conventions. Now I'm bringing along, 128K of code or whatever, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is a lot actually. Into what I'm doing versus if I knew the vanilla, it's 0. So that would be where scalability kicks in. Good, non-weird question. All right. So what that just added there, sorry, I wanted to, right, we'll show the last part. Okay. So this says on the details area, add a border, but then we're doing this. We're saying overflow, handle that automatically, but the height is 70. And what those two things together do is force the height of this container, this div, to be 70, and then have a scroll bar on it. It's a real basic thing, but I don't know that it's an oversight so much as an incredibly annoying aspect of web development is widths you can set and rely on and bank on how wide things are, but heights generally no. Right? So I could set a width of 100%, and that would take up the width of the container. If I said height 100%, unless some other container has said what the height is, that doesn't mean anything. There's no such thing as height is 100% by itself. So a lot of times, in this case, doing some level of constraint-based design to your card, making sure that if there's an image on it, that they're not blowing up the scale of them, making sure that there's certain height requirements as well as width requirements is important. So I gave you a couple tools there or concepts. So for homework, I need you to apply these to your element. Let me move